Hello Internet and welcome to Historical Headlines for the 21st of January. The king loses his head and thus loses his head. Graphic. And we are, I am tempted to say naturally, in Paris, in France, in 1793, where Louis XVI was executed for treason against the constitution that he himself had signed as a constitutional monarch of the new French Royal Republic. It's really a difficult thing to truly express how France was governed at the time, but anyway, with this one move, the French had truly taken the step that set the French Revolution of the 1790s aside from practically everyone else. It wasn't the first time that a French king had lost his throne for whatever reason. It wasn't even the first time a French king had been murdered or assassinated, but it was the first time that he had lost his life going directly against what was considered by the government the will of the people. Of course, the revolution is known for being bloody and a orgy of beheadings at Madame la Guillotine with various French peasantry howling for blood beneath it, but by 1793, or at least January 1793, it hadn't actually been that terribly bad. Following the storming of the Bastille and the removal of, shall we say, complete royal power in favor of a kind of elected government in 1799, there had been some internal power squabbles as the new government figured out how to actually, rule the country, and there had been factionalism and so on. But in general, a sort of, shall we say, moderate bourgeoisie had mostly actually controlled the levers of power at the time, mostly of course under the, if not rule, then at least the influence of a certain Count Mirabeau, who was actually a nobleman, an aristocrat, despite him definitely taking the side of the more common-born revolutionaries. However, all of this was about to change, and it changed specifically today with the execution of the king. And to talk you through the run-up to this event, and of course the execution itself, here is professional naked man Tim Sateson.
Thank you, studio. It will be remembered to all of you how Louis XVI, having been deposed as autocrat of France in 1799, continued on as a kind of constitutional monarch. He was not entirely happy with that, but at least he tried to maintain a certain degree of peace in the country, unlike his brothers who constantly attempted counter-coups against the Republican government. Rather, Louis had attempted to work with Count Mirabeau, one of the more moderate leaders of the new government, to try to at least maintain some kind of power or get back to his own position with some kind of modifications that the Republicans could accept. An attitude that secured him actually a great deal of support in the common people of the country, who saw their king as someone who was trying to do their best for them. Then, unfortunately, in 1791, as you remember, about a year and a half ago, the king attempted to flee Paris, traveling up to Valenciennes, a fortress city in the north, to throw himself under the protection of the Austrian Empire. This changed everything. For the common people, the king's flight from Paris and his total repudiation of the Republic as they saw it was a moment of radicalization. For the moderate and the cautious royalists in the National Assembly, the king's flight also hardened the opinions of their enemies and, of course, put themselves in a difficult position. The king himself was moved into basic prison in Paris, which meant that the other powers of Europe eventually decided to become more hostile towards French before the Republican tendencies and revolutionary ideas spread across nation boundaries into other nations, which of course their governments would not prefer. This in the end led to declaration of war by France against the Empire of Austria, and several other powers eventually joined in. While Louis seemed to have immediately supported the declaration of war by his new constitutional government, eventually in his cell, such as he was imprisoned or not, documents were found that he had in fact been in contact with those foreign enemies to try to get them to re-establish himself under his full power and authority of the Ancien regime. The National Convention immediately had Louis arrested, charged of treason, and eventually, here just a couple of days ago, convicted and sentenced to death, with his cousin Philippe L'Égalité, Duke of Orleans, casting the deciding vote for death over some kind of exile or imprisonment. And here today at the Place de Revolution. The former King of France, Louis XVI, will have his head removed by Madame le Guillotine. And to mark this momentous occasion, we are here talking to a Jean Dubois, a former butcher who is now a member of the National Assembly. Monsieur Dubois, what is your opinion on this most momentous of occasions where, for the first time possibly in history, a king and the entire concept of monarchy perhaps even are being removed from both life and existence by the will of the people rather than a foreign invading power?
Well, I consider it tragic that it would have come to this, but there was no doubt that Le Citizen Louis was betraying the principles of the revolution and also exposing France from foreign invasion. It was only naturally that things would turn out bad, though of course having his head removed was perhaps not what he himself had been hoping for.
This is of course very fair, but do you not fear perhaps that 1,000 years of monarchy thrown out of the window that easily and the king actually executed might have a negative effect on the country until a new system of government has been put fully and firmly in place, especially with the current war which now threatens to embroil the entire continent?
Well, we have recently won the Battle of Valmy and halted the invasion of La Belle France. I am sure eventually the war will continue in our direction and will be finished very, very soon. And the principles of the revolution must be the important one. I truly believe that they are what will lead us into a golden future of democracy and equality and prosperity. Thank you. Ooh, here we go.
Yes, this is true. It is time. The king has finished his speech. He has placed his head inside the guillotine and... Rest in peace, Louis XVI, former King of France. Well, at this moment of introspection, one can only hope that Monsieur Dubois is right, that this will lead us into a glorious future. However, for this reporters, I am not entirely certain that the way into a glorious future is by cutting the heads off people. Back to the studio.
And thank you, Mr. Satan, considering the fact that we know that many people jumped forward once Louis' head had been chopped off to dip their handkerchiefs in his blood, and the fact that you are naked. I am in fact very happy that you did not participate in this particular sport. God knows what you would have dipped. Anyway, he is of course right, Mr. Satan. The execution of Louis XVI did not exactly bring peace, prosperity, glorious progressivism, and happiness to all mankind. It was in fact the beginning of bloodshed and dictatorships to a degree that Louis himself would have never even imagined. In fact, even his ancestor, Louis XIV, who can be described as truly the kind of dictator that the French actually revolted against at this particular time in history, despite him being, dead more than 70 years, would have failed to recognize the terrifying dictatorship that the Reign of Terror and eventually Napoleon would impose upon France within the next 20 years, along with continuous warfare up until Waterloo and the last remaining fights after that in 1815. As an ironic point, of course, the Duke of Orleans, who cast the deciding vote for the execution of his cousin, was in fact executed on the very same scaffold only about 9 months later, so again, the revolution, as always, have a tendency to swallow its own. Nonetheless, despite my personal reservations about the revolution and whatever principles they in fact ended up upholding rather than the ones they wanted to uphold, there is little doubt that this was a momentous occasion in history. It established a principle of democracy that truly did inspire the world. While America, of course, already at this point had been established as a sort of people's republic for some time, France was at this point, of course, far more important on the general world stage, and many of the principles and laws and new customs that came out of the revolution revolution are some that most of us are still at least feeling today in some way or the other. Not to mention that it started the process that would later become almost universal following the second set of revolutions during 1848, that constitutional monarchy was the way forward rather than absolutist one with at least some degree of government in the hands of the people, if not quite the same degree of direct representational democracy as the French had originally anticipated in 1791. This is, however, now becoming very long, so I'm going to end it by saying that this was today's historical headline: the king loses his head and thus loses his head, the execution of Louis XVI and the abolition of 1,000 years of French monarchy in 1793. I shall be back tomorrow with a new historical headline. Until then, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.